Hi guys, in this video we will continue discussing the accounting cycle. So we're done with the journalizing, the posting, trial balance, adjusting entries, worksheet, and financial statements. So now we're going to discuss the step 7, which is the closing entries. The preparation of the closing entries is an indication of the end of the accounting period. And also, it is a governmental requirement for the income tax and renewal of business taxes and permits purposes. And I want you to take note that only the nominal accounts or income statement accounts are closed at the end of the accounting period. So this means that real accounts or balance sheet accounts are held open. Again, only nominal or income statement accounts are closed at the end of the accounting period. Closing actually means reducing the nominal accounts or income statement accounts with open balances into zero balance. So yung gagawin natin is that we're going to close or i-close natin lahat ng income statement accounts in order to arrive at the zero balance. The question now is, why do we need to close the accounts? So the purpose of closing the accounts is to affect the results of its operation to the owner's equity. If the business operation resulted into a profit, so this profit will be added to the owner's equity. And if the business operations resulted into a loss, so this loss will be deducted from the owner's equity. And in closing the accounts, we're going to use this temporary account known as income and expense summary. And here's now the procedures in closing the nominal accounts or income statement accounts. And for discussion purposes, we will still be using our continuing illustration, the Davao Laundry Services. Okay, so we will now begin the discussion on the procedures in closing the nominal accounts or income statement accounts, and we'll start it with the step number 1, close the income account. Davao Laundry Services only has one income account, and that is the laundry income with a credit balance of 80,000 pesos. So this is the balance before the closing entry, 80,000 pesos credit. So since the income has a balance of credit, so in order to close this income account, we need to debit it. Okay, so we're going to get our journal. So this is a new page. So this is page number 3. Pages 1 and 2 are already full. That's why we have this new page, page 3. And then we're going to write first the headings. So we have the year 2019, particulars, folio, debit, and then credit. Closing entries are prepared at the end of the accounting period. And in the case of Davao Laundry Services, its end of accounting period is on March 31, 2019. So we have here for March and then the date 31. And then for the journal entry, so as I mentioned a while ago, laundry income has a credit balance of 80,000 pesos. So in order to close this laundry income, we need to debit it. So therefore, our debit entry is laundry income, and then the amount is 80,000 pesos. And then for our credit, we're going to use our temporary account, which is the income and expense summary, which is also 80,000 pesos. And this is to close income to the income and expense summary account. So now we're going to post this closing entry to the ledger accounts. So let's start with the debit entry, laundry income, 80,000. So let's proceed to the ledger account of laundry income. Again, the debit entry is laundry income of 80,000 pesos. So since this is a debit, so we're going to post this one in the debit side of the laundry income account. So we have the date first, it's for March, and then the date 31. So this is all about the closing entry. For the folio, we're going to write JE3 since this is taken from the journal entry located at the page number 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 80,000 pesos. And as I mentioned in one of the previous videos, I no longer put peso sign in the debit and credit columns of general journal and general ledger since these columns are understood to be money columns and that peso is used as the valuation since we are here in the Philippines. But I would just like to mention that if your teacher wants you to put peso sign, then you have to put peso sign. But as to my students, I don't require them to put peso sign because of that assumption that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so going back here in the laundry income account. So if you notice, in the debit side, we have the debit amount of 80,000, and then in the credit side, we have the credit amount of 80,000. So at this point, the laundry income account is now closed. Closed because if you are going to get the difference between these two amounts, it will give us the answer of zero balance. So 80,000 debit less 80,000 credit, or vice versa, it will give us the same zero balance. So again, at this point, laundry income account is now closed. And don't forget to double rule. Now let's move on to our credit entry, and that is income and expense summary of 80,000 pesos. So let's proceed to the income and expense summary account, and that is account number 12. So we're going to put the column heading first in the credit side. So we have here the year 2019, particulars, folio, and credit. For the date column, we're going to write Mar for March, and then the date 31, and this is all about the closing entry. And for the folio, we're going to write JE3, since this is taken from the General Journal page number 3. And then the amount is 80,000 pesos. Let's now move on to step number 2, and that is to close the expense accounts. So we need to check the general ledgers of Davao Laundry Services in order to find out what are their expenses. And these are the expenses of Davao Laundry Services. So we have uncollectible accounts of 350 pesos, depreciation expense 2,500 pesos, salaries expense 10,000 pesos, rent expense 5,000 pesos, utilities expense 12,000 pesos, laundry supplies expense 20,000 pesos, taxes and licenses 4,000 pesos, advertising expense 3,000 pesos, and lastly, we have interest expense of 1,000 pesos. So if you guys notice, the expenses are located at the debit side of the general ledger. So if we're going to close these accounts, since they are in the debit, we need to credit them. And here's now the general journal. So we're not going to write again the date, since same lang din naman yung date ng closing entry. And in the case of Davao Laundry Services, it is March 31, 2019. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the expenses are all in the debit. So in order to close them, we need to credit them. The question is, what will be our debit entry? So our debit entry would be the temporary account, income, and expense summary. The debit amount of the income and expense summary will be the total of all the expenses. So as of the moment, we're going to leave it blank. Saka na natin siya balikan after our credit entries. So for the credit entries, iisa-isahin natin lahat ng expenses ni Davao Laundry Services. And we'll start it with the uncollectible accounts of 350. So we're going to credit it here in the general journal. So that's why we have uncollectible accounts. The amount is 350 pesos credit. Next is depreciation expense of 2,500 pesos. Salaries expense of 10,000 pesos, rent expense of 5,000 pesos, and then followed by another expense that we need to credit, utilities expense 12,000 pesos, laundry supplies expense 20,000 pesos, taxes and licenses 4,000 pesos, advertising expense 3,000 pesos, and then lastly the interest expense of 1,000 pesos. Okay, so now that we are done crediting all the expenses, the next thing that we're going to do is to total all the credit amounts. As a rule, the total of the debit must always equal to the total of the credit. So that means to say that whatever is the total here and the credit, it must be the same with the debit. Okay, so let's now get the total amount of the credit. So we have 350 pesos plus 2,500 pesos plus 10,000 pesos plus 5,000 pesos plus 12,000 pesos plus 20,000 pesos plus 4,000 pesos plus 3,000 plus 1,000 pesos. So the total credit is 57,850 pesos. And this also means that the debit is also 57,850 pesos. So therefore, our debit is income and expense summary of 57,850 pesos. And this is to record or to close expenses to income and expense summary account. At this point, we will be posting the second closing entry to the affected ledger accounts, and we'll start with the debit, and that is income and expense summary. And here's now the income and expense summary account, and that is account number 12. And since here in the closing entry, the income and expense summary of 57,850 pesos is debited, so therefore, this will be posted in the debit side of the account. In the debit side of the income and expense summary account, we're going to write the column heading first. So for the year, we have 2019, and then particulars, folio, and then the debit. Closing entries are prepared at the end of the accounting period, and in the case of Davao Laundry Services, its end of accounting period is on March 31, 2019. So that's why we have it here, for March, and the date 31. For particulars, we simply put closing entry, and then for folio, it's JA3 since the second closing entry is written in the page 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 57,850 pesos. And then in the general journal, in its folio column, we're going to write JL12 or General Ledger Account number 12. So this means to say that the debit entry of income and expense summary of 57,850 pesos is posted to account number 12. Moving on to the credit entries, we have here first uncollectible account expense of 350 pesos. So this will be posted to the ledger account of uncollectible accounts or uncollectible account expense, and that is account number 14. And since it is credit, so this will be transferred here or posted here in the credit side. The date of the closing entry is March 31. So we have here for March, and the date is 31. So this is all about the closing entry. And for the folio, we're going to write JE3 since the second closing entry is written in the page number 3 in the general journal. And then the amount is 350 pesos. So if you notice, the debit amount of uncollectible accounts and the credit amount of uncollectible accounts are the same, which is 350. So 350 debit less 350 credit, that is equal to 0. So in this, or at this point, the uncollectible accounts account is now closed. So we're just going to simply double rule it. In the general journal, under the folio column, we're going to write JL14. So this means that the credit entry and collectible accounts expense of 350 is posted to account number 14 in the general ledger. Another credit entry is depreciation expense of 2,500 pesos. So this will be posted to the credit side of the depreciation expense account. So we have here March 31. Closing entry, and then JE3. And then the amount is 2,500 pesos. So at this point, the depreciation expense is now closed. So double rule natin. So close siya since if we're going to get the difference between 2,500 debit and 2,500 credit, it will result to a zero balance. And then under the folio column of the general journal, we will write GL15. So this means that the credit entry depreciation expense of 2,500 pesos is posted to general ledger 15 or account number 15. Another credit entry is salaries expense of 10,000 pesos. So this will be posted in the credit side of salaries expense account. So we have here, for the date, we have March 31, and then this is all about the closing entry. And then for the folio, we will write JE3 since the second closing entry is written in the third page of the general journal. And then the amount is 10,000 pesos. At this point, the salaries expense is a closed account because if you're going to get the difference between the 10,000 pesos debit and the 10,000 pesos credit, the answer to that is 0. So this means that salaries expense has a 0 balance. And since the balance is 0, so that again means that the account is already closed. So what we need to do is just to double rule the amounts. Ayan. And then here in the general journal, under the folio column, we will write JL16. So this means that the credit entry salaries expense of 10,000 pesos is posted to account number 16 in the general ledger. Another credit entry is rent expense of 5,000 pesos. So this will be posted in the credit side of the rent expense account. So we have here the date, it's March 31. So this is all about the closing entry. And then in the folio, it's JA3 and then the amount is 5,000 pesos. At this point, the rent expense is a closed account because the difference between the debit and credit is now 0. So double rule na lang natin yung amounts. Ayan. And then here in the general journal, under the folio column, we will write JL17. And then moving on to the next credit entry is utilities expense of 12,000 pesos. So this will be posted in the credit side of the utilities expense account. So we have here March 31. So this is for the closing entry. And then in the folio, we will write JE3 and then the amount is 12,000 pesos. So after the posting, the utilities expense is now a closed account because the difference between debit, which is 12,000, and credit, which is also 12,000, is 0. So double rule natin yung amounts. Okay. And then in the general journal, we will write GL18 under the folio column since the credit entry utilities expense, which is 12,000 pesos, is posted to General Ledger 18 or account number 18. Next is laundry supplies expense of 20,000 pesos. So this will be posted here in the credit side of laundry supplies expense. So we have the date, March 31, and then this is all about the closing entry. For the folio, it's JA3 since this is taken from the closing entry written in the page 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 20,000 pesos. So the laundry supplies expense after the posting has now a 0 balance. So this means that this account is already a closed account. So let's just double rule the amounts. Ayan. And then under the folio column of the general journal, we will write GL19. So this means that the credit entry laundry supplies expense of 20,000 pesos is posted to or transferred to account number 19 in the general ledger. Moving on to the next credit entry, and that is taxes and licenses of 4,000 pesos. So this will be posted to or transferred to the credit side of the taxes and licenses account. So we have the date, it's March 31. So this is all about the closing entry, and for the folio, it's JA3. And then the amount is 4,000 pesos. So we just have to double rule since at this point, taxes and licenses is a closed account. And then here in the folio column of the general journal, we will write GL20. Next credit entry is advertising expense of 3,000 pesos. So we will post it here in the credit side of the advertising expense account. So we have March 31. For the particulars, it's closing entry and then folio JA3 and then the amount is 3,000 pesos. So advertising expense is now a closed account. So double rule. And then in the general journal under the folio column, we will write GL21 since advertising expense of 3,000 pesos credit is posted to General Ledger 21 or account number 21. And then lastly, we have this credit entry interest expense of 1,000 pesos. So this will be posted in the credit side of the interest expense account. So we have here the date, it's March 31. So this is all about the closing entry. And then for the folio, it's JE3 and then the amount is 1,000 pesos. So at this point, the interest expense is a closed account. And then here in the general journal, under the folio column, we will write GL22. At this point, all the expense accounts of Davao Laundry Services has been closed to the temporary account income and expense summary. And with that, we are all set to move on to the next step, and that is step number 3. The step number 3 actually has two procedures. And first of that is to put the debit and credit entries of the income and expense summary account ledger. And here's now the income and expense summary account. The 57,850 pesos placed in the debit side is the total expenses that we previously closed to income and expense summary account when we were discussing the step number 2. And then the 80,000 pesos placed in the credit side is the income that we previously closed to income and expense summary when we were discussing the step number 1. So now we will get the difference between these two amounts. So 80,000 less 57,850 is equals to 22,150. So this represents the profit because income is greater than the expenses. Take note that the amount of difference, which is 22,150 pesos, is written in the credit side. That is because the credit is greater than the debit. However, if the amount of the debit side of the income and expense summary account is greater than its credit side, the amount of the difference will represent a loss. And since it is a loss, the amount of difference will be written in the debit side since the debit is greater than the credit. After putting the debit and credit entries of the income and expense summary account ledger, the next thing that we're going to do is to close the income and expense summary to S. Santos Capital account. The income and expense summary account showed a credit balance of 22,150 pesos. So since it is a credit balance, in order to close it, we need to debit the income and expense summary by 22,150. So that's why we have here in our page 3 of our general journal, our debit is income and expense summary of 22,150 pesos. And for the credit entry, it will be S. Santos Capital of 22,150 pesos. This is to close the profit to capital account. So in this journal entry or in this closing entry, the capital account of S. Santos is increased by 22,150 pesos. In case of a loss, the amount of loss is closed using this closing entry. Debit to capital and credit to income and expense summary. So the capital is being debited. It's because a loss is a deduction from the capital. And take note that the normal balance or the increased side of capital is in the credit. So in order to reduce or to deduct the capital balance, we need to debit it. And then the income and expense summary is being credited because when there is a loss, that means that the income and expense summary has a debit balance. So since it is in the debit, so in order to close it, we need to credit the said account. Okay, so now we will be posting our third closing entry to its affected ledger accounts. And we'll start with the debit entry here in the general journal. We have income and expense summary of 22,150. So under its folio column, we will write GL12 since this will be posted to account number 12 of the general ledger. And since it is a debit, so this will be posted to the debit side of the income and expense summary account. So we have here in the debit side, closing entry under the particulars column, and then in the folio is JE3 since this is taken from the page number 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 22,150 pesos. So at this point, the income and expense summary is a closed account because if we're going to get the difference between these two, the answer to that is zero balance. So 22,150 pesos debit less 22,150 pesos credit. So that is equal to 0. Now for our credit entry, S. Santos Capital of 22,150. So this will be posted to S. Santos Capital account, which is account number 10. So here in the folio column of the general journal, we will write GL10 or general ledger 10 or account number 10 in the general ledger. And then here in the general ledger, we will be posting our credit entry as Santos Capital. So the date of this is March 31. So we'll write 31. And then this is all about the closing entry. And then for the folio, it's JE3, since this is taken from the page number 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 22,150 pesos. We will now move on to step number 4, and that is the close drawing account to capital account. So this is the amount of S. Santos drawing, 10,000 pesos. So a drawing is a reduction or a deduction from the capital balance. And the normal balance or the increased side of the capital is in the credit. So in order to reduce it, we need to debit it. That's why here in our credit entry, we debit S. Santos capital of 10,000 pesos. By the way, no longer write the date because we're still in the page number 3 of the general journal. And then the first closing entry we had, which is also written in the page number 3, is dated March 31. And same lang din naman yung date ng closing entry. So, hindi ko siya inulit pa. For our credit entry, so the S. Santos drawing is in a debit balance of 10,000 pesos. So in order to close it, we need to credit it. So that's why our credit entry is S. Santos drawing of 10,000 pesos. So this is to close drawing account to capital account. And now we will be posting this closing entry to its affected ledger accounts. And we'll start with the debit entry S. Santos Capital, 10,000 pesos. So this will be posted to the account number 10 of the general ledger. That's why here in the folio column, we will write GL10. And since it is a debit, so this will be posted in the debit side of the S. Santos Capital. So that's why here in the date column, we have March 31. And then in the particulars, it's all about the closing entry. For the folio, it's JE3 since this is taken from the page number 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 10,000 pesos. Now for the credit entry S. Santos drawing of 10,000 pesos. So this will be posted to account number 11 in the general ledger. That's why here in the folio column of the general journal, we will write GL11. And since this is a credit, so this will be posted to the credit side of account number 11 S. Santos drawing. So we have the date, it's March 31. So this is all about the closing entry. And folio is JE3 since this is taken from the page number 3 of the general journal. And then the amount is 10,000 pesos. Now we will be footing the debit and credit entries and we'll start with the S. Santos Capital account. So for the debit side, we have 10,000 pesos. And then for the credit side, we have 850,000 plus 22,150. So the total is 872,150. Now we'll get the balance. So 872,150 less the 10,000. So the difference is 862,150. And we will be writing it here in the credit side since the credit is greater than the debit, and then double rule. Now for the S. Santos drawing. So we have 10,000 in the debit and 10,000 in the credit. So at this point, S. Santos drawing is a closed account. So double rule natin. So it's a closed account because the difference between the 10,000 debit and 10,000 credit is 0. And here's now the complete picture of the closing entries of Davao Laundry Services. The first closing entry refers to step number 1 in which we close the income account. The second closing entry refers to step number 2 in which we close the expense accounts. The closing entry number 3 refers to step number 3 in which we close the income and expense summary to capital account. And lastly, the fourth closing entry is all about the step number 4 in which we close the drawing account to capital account.